I take people around, or with the group that now run the alchemical journey, we take people around the zodiac, around the wheel of the year, experiencing each sign and entering into the mystery of each astrological sign, so that we can awaken that perspective within us. And I think this is the basis of a lot of the mystery school traditions of old, and we're kind of reawakening that within a contemporary setting. And that excites me, that idea that I believe we're all astrologers in one sense.
We're all astrologers. That is something that I believe as well, very much, because I tend to see it as we have the sky within us,
right.
And that makes us astrologers. How do you understand that statement?
I understand it in the sense that we all have... Astrology for me is an art of the imagination, more before it's a science. Mm-hmm. I think it's a science in a broad definition of what we describe as science. I don't think it's a science in the modern narrow definition of science. It doesn't meet the empirical challenge that modern science demands.
I agree.
And I'm very glad that it doesn't. Thank God that it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if it did, it would be turned into some horrible mechanism for,
control.
Completely. So
yes.
Every time it fails one of the tests that science puts it to, I'm so delighted when that happens, because it means that science will just leave it alone and go, we're really not bothered about it. So I'm not really interested in astrology having to prove itself under any kind of empirical in test or circumstance, because for me the very test itself is fraud.
I must be very forthcoming with the audience. John and I both have been well taught by an amazing person, Patrick Curry. And so, because he is our mutual tutor at different times at different schools,
right.
But he is one of the leading authorities on astrology as a philosophy, leading academic authorities on the history of astrology and the philosophical understanding of astrology. And so as you're talking, I'm just kind of nodding because I completely understand the perspective that you're coming from. For me, I think to myself that, whenever a scientist comes out and says, I've disproved astrology, I think to myself, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. I mean, it's saying that unless something can be scientifically proven, it has no value in the world. I mean, do scientists do tests to prove music?
Or love?
Exactly, yes. That's very...
They haven't found an empirical test to
right.
prove whether someone's in love or not yet. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of obvious, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. We go back to, again, I know that you're going to know what I'm talking about because we've both been influenced by Patrick, but it's the Cartesian split, right?
Right, Cartesian split,
yes.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that separation of matter from spirit. And because there is that separation, it sounds like the scientists are trying to make something that is spirit fit into their paradigm of matter, and it doesn't work that way.
I'll tell you what I'm interested in. I'm interested in soul, in my definition of soul, if you like. For me, there's an in-between. There's spirit and there's matter. There's like the macrocosm and the microcosm, if you like, in some way. Not an exact fit, but... And then there's this in-between realm, which I've heard called the mesocosm, which is messy, it's like the messy mesocosm. I've heard someone say that, I can't remember who it was. But I like that idea of that in between that, there's all this kind of there's these archetypes of gods or daemons or in between, intermediary, neither one thing nor the other, and that for me is the realm of imagination. That's what I like to talk about as the imaginal realm, after Henri Corbin's term. It's because imagination is so kind of done. It's become, within a modern scientific paradigm, a kind of embellishment of language. Imagination is like almost a luxury that we have, which is kind of nice, but it's not real. So imagination has become to equate to something false. And yet imagination for me is everything, because everything that we do requires our whole way of the way that we interpret our lives, the way that we make it, or the way that we piece it all together, the way that we piece meaning together, requires imagination. And a scientist is using their imagination just as much as a poet.
I definitely think of astrology as a practice in poetry, because you're taking this, object, as we would call them, the planets, we'd call them objects, and you're translating it, you're looking at it as a symbol and translating it into a language that is going to be relevant for your client.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think I go further than that even. That I don't see us as translators, more as facilitators of imagination. I think for me, the planet exists not just as a planet, because we can say it's an object in the sky, but it's also a god or a goddess. It's also, the moon. I like this distinction between I think it's a relevant distinction between a simile and a metaphor. That when we look at the sunflower, we could rationally say, okay, so the sunflower is like the sun, or the lion with its mane is like the sun. And then we could say, well, that's why people decided that the sun and the lion should be associated, or the sun and the sunflower should be associated. But the magical aspect of that, or the imaginal aspect of that, is that the sun is the sunflower, the sun is the lion, the sun is gold. And that's a metaphor rather than a simile, and that, I think, it's when we can that starts to impregnate into our awareness that we then begin to enter the realm of the imaginal astrologer, because you're then working in a way, you're transcending the rational in some sense when you do that, almost as if they partake. I love the way the sunflower turns its head toward the sun, and it's, why does it do that? I don't know, but it does it, and as it does it, it's almost, the poet would look at that and it would see the consciousness in the sunflower. It wouldn't try and the poet doesn't try and explain that, why that happens rationally or scientifically. It just sees the consciousness in the sunflower turning its head toward the sun. Now, a scientist might say that's naive. Consciousness in the sunflower, that's just nature's process, and I'm certain that there must be some kind of rational reason why it does that. But it's like but it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter to the poet. It doesn't matter to Wordsworth or Coleridge or Keats or any. It's that ability to read. I think you have to go into. For me as an astrologer, I have to go into that mindset in order for what I do to feel alive and in the moment and relevant. And I'm helping people to make sense of their lives within that context. But I have to remain. I have Mercury in Pisces. I have to remain in a poetic. For me, there's more poetic reverie than science in an astrological consultation. That's a terrible thing to say.
Beautiful.